There are things in life that change in silence. No lightning, no drama, no breaking of glass. Just a slight shift in air, a glance held a second too long, a hesitation at the dinner table. That's how it started for me. Not with a decision, but with a moment I didn't yet know I would never unlive. He arrived late in the afternoon, dragging a dusty suitcase and a worn leather backpack. I heard the wheels scrape the stones before I saw him. Taller than I remembered, broader in the shoulders, his hair slightly longer and his eyes somehow quieter. He smiled the way only people smile when they don't belong to a place anymore, and yet have no choice but to return to it. My husband greeted him first, pulling him into a brief, tight embrace with that masculine restraint men his age always carry. I stood behind, clutching a dish towel in my hands, suddenly aware of how it clung to my damp palms. He turned to me, and for a second, just a second, his eyes lingered. Not out of recognition or affection, but out of assessment. As if I were a book he once read too young and now was curious to revisit. "It's been a while," I said. My voice betrayed nothing. I'd had years to perfect that skill. "It has," he replied, placing the suitcase by the wall. "You haven't changed much." That wasn't true, of course. I had changed in places makeup couldn't reach. In the curve of my spine from years at a desk. In the rhythm of my thoughts. In the places I kept quiet. But I smiled anyway, as if his words were kind. That evening, we ate together at the long oak table in the kitchen. The windows open to let in the scent of the late summer dusk. My husband poured wine. The conversation was casual, circling work, cities, new clients, renovations. I let the men talk. I listened, the way I always did, nodding at the right moments, laughing when expected. My role was familiar, like an old cardigan I slipped into without thinking. But beneath the table, the heel of my bare foot brushed against his. It was nothing. A mistake? A flicker. I withdrew it immediately, but not before our eyes met. He looked at me, not with alarm, not with apology, but with a stillness that unsettled me. Not accusatory, not inviting, just there, present. I looked away. After dinner, I stayed behind to clear the plates, rinsing them in the sink while my husband showed him to the guest room. The sound of their voices upstairs was muffled by walls, by years of routine and politeness. I moved slowly, my fingers lingering on the ceramic edges of plates, my reflection bending across the surface of the faucet. Later, alone in my bedroom, I opened the drawer where I kept what I never wore. Things I had once bought for myself. Silk, lace, fabrics that whispered instead of spoke. I didn't know why I reached for them now. I only knew I didn't want to wear cotton that night. I chose a bodysuit I hadn't touched in over a year. Dark green, with lace that crept up the sides and curved like ivy over skin. I put it on beneath my robe. No one would see it. Not him. Not my husband. But I would feel it. When I turned off the light, I lay down and realized I hadn't spoken to my husband since we got into bed. His breathing was steady, back turned to me as always, a quiet wall between our bodies. I watched the ceiling, waiting for sleep to find me. But my skin, under the lace, under the sheets, remembered too much. The next morning brought no confrontation, no strange remarks. The rhythm of the house continued as usual. Breakfast, emails, laundry. My husband left for work. The quiet returned, stretching across the rooms like fog. He came into the kitchen late, barefoot, hair slightly damp from the shower. I poured coffee, trying not to look at his shoulders. He leaned against the doorway, watching me. "Everything feels exactly the same here," he said, almost to himself. "But not quite." "Time does that," I replied. My voice was even, but my spine tingled. He wasn't just talking about furniture and paint. We didn't say more. I spent most of the day outside, pruning the bushes that had grown wild near the back fence. My mind kept looping back to the dinner, to the silence beneath the table, to the bodysuit still hugging my body under a sundress now dusted with earth. I wasn't used to being seen. Not like that. Not without effort. And certainly not by someone who shouldn't see me. That night, I cooked again. We sat in the same places. The house lights flickered slightly, something with the wiring. My husband told a story about a colleague's dog. Something trivial, something long. I nodded, laughed, passed the salt. And again I saw it happened. Not by accident this time. He touched my hand, lightly, in passing, as he reached for the wine. His fingers grazed mine, and this time I didn't move away. It was no more than half a second, but I felt it down my spine like heat. He looked at me across the rim of his glass, his expression unreadable, as if asking a question without words and daring me to pretend I hadn't heard it. I excused myself early that evening, claiming a headache. My husband mumbled something, already engrossed in a news segment on TV. I walked up the stairs slowly, each step heavy, as if the weight of that touch had sunk into my bones. In the bathroom, I undressed in silence, turned on the water, watched steam fog the mirror. When I slipped out of the bodysuit, I ran my fingers along the fabric before placing it gently into the laundry basket. The skin beneath it still remembered the warmth of the gaze that had never touched it. That night, I slept restlessly. My body curled into itself, aching with something I didn't know how to name. Not desire, not fear. Something far more dangerous. Anticipation. And I knew, with a quiet certainty I hadn't yet allowed myself to say aloud, this house, this man, this return, none of it would leave me untouched. The days that followed passed slowly, not because of any change in routine, but because something had cracked open inside me. And now every movement, every glance, every shared space throbbed with awareness. I became hyper-attuned to presence. His footsteps on the stairs, the shift in weight on a chair, the soft scrape of his coffee cup against the counter. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was nothing, that I was 42 years old and married and stable and careful, that I didn't wake up wondering what shirt he would wear or whether I would catch him watching me from the hallway. But my body was not interested in rational explanations. It remembered everything. His touch, his breath, the way he hadn't looked away. We were never alone in the same room for long. A strange dance began. Not of avoidance, but of precision. He would enter the kitchen as I was leaving it. I would step out to water the plants just as he moved into the study. A part of me was relieved, convinced that the danger would pass if only we gave it enough time to dissolve in silence. But silence does not dissolve danger. It concentrates it. It was a Thursday when it happened, not a remarkable day. The weather was dry, sky overcast, the kind of sky that made the world look flattened and dull. My husband had left for a client meeting in the city, one that would keep him out until after midnight. It wasn't unusual. He had warned me about it a week prior, even suggested I treat myself to a long bath, maybe open a bottle of wine, watch a movie he wouldn't enjoy. Take the night off, he had said with a warm smile, and I had smiled back. Take the night off, as if I had that kind of control anymore. By late afternoon, the house was quiet. I had been reading in the sunroom, a book I couldn't follow, the words sliding through me without grip. I knew he was somewhere upstairs. The faint sound of his playlist pulsed through the ceiling above me. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't breathe in the same way I used to. I went to the kitchen instead, began slicing vegetables for dinner I didn't intend to eat. Something just to do with my hands. I opened the fridge, closed it, set the table, took a plate away, poured a glass of water and forgot to drink it. Then I heard his footsteps. Slow even. He was barefoot again, the way he always was indoors, and when he entered, he didn't say anything. Just leaned against the frame of the kitchen doorway, arms folded. I didn't turn to face him right away. You don't need to keep disappearing every time I enter a room, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. I'm not, he said, and I could feel his eyes on my back. You've just been hard to catch. I turned slowly, keeping the knife in my hand, not for defense, but for grounding. His expression wasn't smug or teasing. It was unreadable, but not indifferent. I thought you might want space, he added. Space doesn't help when the problem isn't distance, I replied before I could stop myself. And then, quickly, I mean, we live in the same house. It's bound to feel tense? I didn't answer. I looked down at the carrot I'd been slicing, now soft and misshapen from too much pressure. He stepped closer, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough for the air to change. I could smell his cologne. Faint, something woody, dry, clean. He reached for a glass, filled it at the sink, and drank. I watched his throat move. It shouldn't have mattered. It shouldn't have been intimate. But it was. He set the glass down, looked at me, not smiling. "Can I ask you something?" he said. I nodded, though my chest had already tightened. "That night on the veranda, why didn't you pull away?" I looked at him then. Really looked. And in that moment, I saw not the son of my husband, not the boy who had once played video games in our living room, but a man. A man standing in my kitchen asking a question that had lived in both of us. "Because I didn't want to," I said. I didn't whisper it. I didn't dress it in layers of excuses or subtlety. I just told him the truth, because anything else felt dishonest. He didn't move, but something in his face changed. A flicker of breath, a softening of the eyes, something unspoken that twisted the moment into a knot. He walked closer. Close enough that I could see the faint scar on his cheek from some long-forgotten accident. Close enough that the heat from his body reached mine. He didn't touch me. "I think about it," he said, "more than I should." "I know." And then, without planning, without pretense, he kissed me. It wasn't cinematic. There was no swelling music or rain at the windows. It was quiet, bare, focused. His hand came to my jaw, his thumb resting just under my ear, his lips finding mine with a calm hunger that made my knees soften. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an apology. It was a continuation. I let the knife drop onto the counter, forgotten. My hands moved to his chest, fingers curling against the fabric of his shirt. His breath hitched, just slightly, and I felt it in my mouth, that flicker of control slipping. Then it ended. He pulled away, not in guilt, not in panic, but in restraint. He looked at me for a long time, not needing answers, just holding the reality of what had happened. "I should go," he said finally, barely above a whisper. I didn't stop him. I couldn't. When he left the room, I stayed where I was, the shape of his kiss still imprinted on my skin. The kitchen had not changed. The house had not collapsed. But I was no longer the woman who had stood in this room the night before. I touched my lips. They burned. Later that night, I lay in bed alone. The sheets cool, the silence stretching. I thought of telling myself to forget it, to let it pass, to pretend. But I already knew pretending was no longer possible, because I didn't want to forget. I wanted more. I didn't sleep that night. Not truly. I lay still for hours, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling as if the room were breathing around me. My body ached in a way that wasn't pain, but a raw, electric longing that clung to every nerve. Not just for touch, though that too, but for the terrifying clarity of being seen, noticed, wanted, in a way that had nothing to do with duty or comfort or time served. I got out of bed before dawn. My husband was asleep beside me, turned to the wall as always. His breathing was deep, steady, untouched by the tremors that had taken root inside me. I watched him for a moment. Not with anger, not with contempt, but with a strange, detached tenderness. He had no idea what was shifting just beneath the surface. What he'd allowed into our lives with the trust of someone who'd never learned to look for cracks. By mid-morning, I'd convinced myself it had to stop. That there couldn't, be anything else. That the kiss, the second kiss, the one that left me trembling with absence after he walked away, was a boundary we couldn't cross again. And then, before I could fortify my resolve, my husband made a suggestion that split the ground beneath me. "You should go to the cabin with him this weekend," he said over breakfast, glancing at his phone between bites of toast. You know the place better than I do, and it needs checking before winter. I blinked. The cabin? Yeah, he nodded. You two can drive up early Saturday. Spend the night if needed. I've got the quarterly meeting, and he said he'd go anyway, but it might be easier if you're there. He meant it as a convenience, a practical decision. We had the keys. I knew the old heating system. I could show him where the fuse box was, how to restart the stubborn water heater, which drawer held the matches and the old flashlights. I don't know how I kept my voice steady. Sure, I said, if it helps. He smiled, kissed the top of my head. The familiar, dry warmth of a husband who no longer asks if he's welcome in your thoughts. The ride to the cabin was quiet. We didn't speak much, not at first. The road curved gently through the trees, bare branches tracing lines against the gray sky. I kept my eyes on the horizon, hands folded tightly in my lap. He didn't try to fill the silence, and that made it worse. He sat with the tension, let it stretch between us, not out of malice, but because he knew. He knew it was real. At one point, he reached for the radio but didn't turn it on, just left his fingers resting on the dial, thoughtful. I didn't ask him to send you, he said finally, without looking at me. I know. He trusts you. I know that too. He hesitated. Should he? I turned to look at him then. Really look. His jaw was tight, but not clenched. His eyes flicked to mine and held, unblinking. I didn't answer right away. It's not about trust, I said at last. It's about gravity. Gravity? Some things just pull. We didn't speak after that. Not until we reached the cabin, the old two-room place tucked into the edge of the woods, with its creaking porch and chimneys still blackened from last winter. I hadn't been there in almost 2 years. The key turned the same way. The door opened with the same reluctant groan. Dust lingered in the air, stirred by the first steps across wooden floors. We set to work without conversation. He checked the windows. I lit the pilot light in the stove. We moved around each other like quiet moons in orbit, careful not to touch. But I felt him. Every time he passed behind me. Every time I heard his breath, or the way he adjusted his sleeves. I had worn a long cardigan over a soft cotton dress. Nothing dramatic, nothing designed to provoke. But I had chosen that dress deliberately. It clung in just the right places. Not because I planned anything, because I couldn't not plan. That evening, we built a fire in the small stone hearth. He opened a bottle of wine from the dusty cabinet and handed me a glass without a word. We sat on opposite sides of the room, the flames snapping softly between us. He watched the fire for a long time before speaking. When I was a kid, he said, this place felt enormous, like a castle. I remember, I said. You used to sleep in the loft and say you could hear the trees breathe. He smiled, barely. I still think I can. I sipped my wine, letting the heat spread through me. Outside, the wind had picked up, brushing the leaves against the windows like gentle fingers. The cabin felt smaller now, more intimate, as if it had shrunk to fit only 2 people. I don't know how to be in this, he said suddenly. Whatever this is. I looked at him. You don't have to be anything. That's the problem, he said. I want to be. He stood then, slowly, and crossed the room, stopped just in front of me, not touching, not presuming. I'm not a kid, he said, and you're not a mistake. I should have stopped him. I should have stood up and moved away, or said something firm and final. But I didn't. I looked up at him, my breath shallow, and let the moment decide for me. He leaned down, and we kissed. It was different from the first 2 times. Slower, deeper. Not a question, not even an answer, just an inevitability. His hands moved to my waist, not possessive, just grounding. I felt the curve of his palms, the warmth of his chest as he pulled me gently to stand. I didn't feel like a wife. I didn't feel like a criminal. I felt like a woman who had been silent for too long. When we parted, he rested his forehead against mine. I'm scared of what happens next, he whispered. So am I said. We didn't sleep together that night, not in that way. We slept in separate beds, the air still vibrating with what had happened. I lay awake again, this time watching the shadows cast by firelight across the ceiling. And in that light, I understood something new. This was no longer just a flirtation, no longer a danger to resist. It was a hunger that had finally learned its name. The silence in the car on the drive back was no longer tentative. It had form, weight, a presence all its own, settled between us like a third passenger we refused to acknowledge. I watched the trees pass in blurred motion through the window, but my thoughts kept replaying the way his hands had felt on my waist, the press of his forehead against mine, the heat that lingered long after we'd returned to our separate corners of the night. Neither of us spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because we both knew that words would only make it more real. By the time we reached the driveway, the sun had started to fall behind the horizon. The house stood in its familiar stillness, waiting for our return, indifferent to what we had brought back inside us. My husband's car was already there. He'd beaten us home, despite his claims of a late meeting. As we stepped inside, the illusion of normalcy snapped back into place with the ease of a well-practiced performance. Coats were hung, shoes removed, polite greetings exchanged. How was it? He asked us, one hand still holding his phone, the other adjusting his glasses. Fine, I answered first, too quickly. He glanced at me, then at his son. Everything working all right up there? Yeah, he said, calm as ever. Nothing serious. I could feel it then, the fracture in the room. Tiny, almost imperceptible, like a crack along glass that only reveals itself in the right light. My husband didn't notice, or chose not to. His attention had already drifted back to an email. At dinner, I could barely taste the food. My hands moved with practiced grace, cutting, chewing, lifting the glass. But my mind was elsewhere, stuck in a memory that refused to fade. His eyes across the firelight. His breath, warm and steady. The softness in his voice when he said he was scared. After the dishes were done, I lingered in the kitchen, hands on the edge of the sink, eyes locked on the empty space outside the window. The sky was dark now, but the glass reflected the interior. I saw myself, pale, still, exhausted, and I saw him behind me, standing just beyond the doorway, watching in silence. He didn't speak. He didn't move, and neither did I. That night, I didn't wear lace. I didn't wear silk. I climbed into bed with bare skin beneath a worn cotton t-shirt and shorts, my hair pulled back, my body tired. My husband joined me later, slipping in with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to routine. He said nothing. He didn't reach for me, and I didn't expect him to. But I lay awake long after he began to snore, eyes open in the dark, wondering how long I could live like this. Split in half between the life I built and the life that had started building itself without my permission. The following days passed with strained ordinariness. The three of us moved around each other carefully, like dancers in a fragile choreography. Nothing was said, but everything was known. I noticed the way he stopped meeting my eyes, the way he left rooms a little too quickly. He had begun to disappear in small, deliberate ways, eating earlier, going on long walks alone, closing his door when he worked. At first, I told myself it was guilt, his way of creating distance, a self-imposed exile. But then, one afternoon, I found his sketchbook left open on the living room table. It wasn't carelessness. He never left it out. The page it lay open to stopped me cold. It was a drawing of me, my face captured in a moment I couldn't place. Eyes closed, head tilted slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear. The lines were delicate, intimate. There was no sensuality in it, no dramatization, just presence. Just a woman being seen. I touched the edge of the paper, tracing the pencil lines with the pad of my finger. It felt like standing in front of a mirror. Only this version of me looked softer, realer, less armored. as if he'd seen something I hadn't let anyone see in years. I closed the book gently and placed it back where I'd found it. That night, I knocked on his door. He opened it slowly, his expression unreadable, but I saw it. The flicker of surprise, of apprehension. "I saw the drawing," I said. He didn't respond, didn't try to explain. "You're avoiding me," I added. "I have to," he said, voice low. "It's the only way this stops." I stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by the lamp on his desk. A sweatshirt hung over the back of his chair. The bed was unmade. His phone buzzed silently on the floor. "I'm not asking you to stop," I said. He looked at me then. "You should." I sat down on the edge of the bed, legs crossed, hands in my lap. "Tell me why." He shook his head. "You're married. He's my father. We live under the same roof. That's reason enough." "That's a list of facts," I said. "Not a reason." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration simmering just beneath the surface. "You think I don't want this? You think I don't replay every second of it when I close my eyes? I'm trying to be the person who walks away. For both of us." I stared at him. "What if I don't want you to walk away?" Silence filled the space between us again, but it was no longer neutral. It vibrated with tension, with all the things we didn't know how to say out loud. When I finally stood to leave, he reached out, not to stop me, but just to touch. His fingers brushed mine. Barely there, a whisper of contact. It was enough to make my heart seize. "I don't know how long I can stay," he said.
Su otra mano me rozó el brazo desnudo, y esa caricia mínima bastó para desatar algo que llevaba días esperando estallar. Nos besamos. Esta vez sin freno, sin cálculo. Fue un beso profundo, anclado en la necesidad y la urgencia. No había juego ni dulzura, sino un hambre callada que se arrastraba desde el jardín, desde la cocina, desde aquel primer roce de manos. Su cuerpo se acercó más al mío. No nos abrazamos, pero sentí el calor de su pecho, su respiración acelerada. El vino, la noche, la cercanía. Todo era excusa, todo era verdad. Nos separamos al escuchar un sonido dentro de la casa. Un paso, quizás. Nos miramos. Su pulgar todavía rozaba mi cadera. Yo tenía el corazón en la garganta. Corrí hacia el interior como si huyera de un incendio. Subí a la habitación, cerré la puerta y me senté en la cama con las piernas temblando. No lloré. No me sentí culpable. Me sentí abrumada por el deseo, por la verdad brutal de saber que lo que había sentido no era una fantasía, era real, irreversible. Mi esposo subió minutos después. Sonreía, se veía contento. Me habló de lo bien que le hacía ese lugar. Dijo que deberíamos venir más seguido. Yo respondí con un murmullo y fingí estar cansada. Me acosté junto a él, pero no pude dormir. La madrugada me encontró con los ojos abiertos, el cuerpo aún encendido, la piel sedienta. Cada vez que cerraba los ojos, recordaba el beso, el sabor, la fuerza, el temblor en sus manos. Y algo dentro de mí se quebraba, no de dolor, sino de certeza. A la mañana siguiente, me vestí con cuidado. Elegí una blusa suelta, una falda larga. Nada provocador, pero me detuve más de lo necesario frente al espejo. Me perfumé detrás de las orejas. Me recogí el cabello con una pinza dorada. No para él. No para mi esposo. Para mí. Porque mi cuerpo ya no era ese objeto que se cubre por rutina. Era algo vivo, activo, pulsante. Desayunamos en silencio. Él apenas probó bocado. Su mirada no se cruzó con la mía, pero yo sabía que en su cuerpo seguía el eco de lo que habíamos hecho. Mi esposo hablaba de un sendero que quería explorar, de un arroyo escondido. Nos propuso acompañarlo. Aceptamos, como si nada. Durante la caminata, el paisaje parecía ajeno a todo. Árboles, piedras, insectos, brisa. Mi esposo iba delante, entusiasmado. Él y yo nos quedamos atrás, a pasos lentos. El camino era estrecho. En un momento, su mano rozó mi espalda. Fue un gesto breve, como para apartar una rama. Pero mi cuerpo se encendió como si me hubiera tocado con fuego. Esa noche no hubo cena. Mi esposo se acostó temprano, exhausto. Yo fingí leer un libro. Él se quedó en el porche, en silencio. Volví a salir cuando todos dormían. Caminé hasta el borde del jardín. Lo encontré ahí, apoyado en la baranda, fumando. No hablamos. Me acerqué. Nos quedamos en silencio, mirando hacia la nada. No hubo beso. No hubo palabras. Solo la presencia del otro como una forma de confesión. Y en ese silencio, supe que ya no había regreso. Que lo que había empezado no podía deshacerse. Que no se trataba solo de un error. Era un deseo. Un vínculo. Una herida abierta que no estaba dispuesta a cerrar. El regreso a casa fue silencioso. No en apariencia, claro. Hubo conversaciones triviales durante el trayecto, pequeños comentarios sobre el clima, el tráfico, un par de chistes amables lanzados por mi esposo, que yo respondía con una sonrisa automática. Pero debajo de todo eso, en esa capa invisible que sostiene lo que nadie se atreve a decir, el silencio era total. Él, el hijo, tampoco hablaba mucho. Iba en el asiento trasero, con los auriculares puestos, la mirada fija en el paisaje que pasaba por la ventanilla. Desde el retrovisor, de vez en cuando, lo observaba. No buscaba nada específico, solo quería comprobar que aún estaba ahí. Cuando llegamos, todo volvió a ocupar su sitio. Las maletas en el vestidor, los zapatos limpios en la entrada, la casa recuperando su forma habitual, como si el viaje no hubiera sido más que una pausa breve, una excursión inofensiva. Mi esposo se encerró en su estudio casi de inmediato, diciendo que tenía que ponerse al día con algunos correos. Yo aproveché para ducharme. El agua caliente cayendo sobre mi piel fue un alivio momentáneo, pero también un recordatorio. Mi cuerpo seguía ardiendo, no por el calor, sino por lo que callaba. Durante las siguientes horas, él y yo evitamos coincidir. No sé si fue una decisión de ambos o un reflejo natural del miedo, pero algo en mí lo extrañaba con desesperación. No se trataba solo del deseo del cuerpo, de la atracción física. Era algo más primitivo. Necesitaba saber que lo que habíamos sentido en aquella casa no había sido producto del aislamiento, del vino, de la noche. Necesitaba confirmar que aún lo sentía. Ese mismo día por la tarde, mientras yo organizaba algunos papeles en el salón, lo vi cruzar el pasillo sin mirarme. Su espalda recta, su paso firme, pero había algo en su modo de moverse que me pareció distinto, tenso, distante. Me acerqué a la ventana solo para hacer algo con las manos.
My lipstick faint on his mouth. I can't keep doing this, he said, stepping back. Not like this. I swallowed hard, throat dry. I know. I'm not asking you to choose, but you need me to. He nodded. We sat in silence for a long time. He stayed in the chair. I stayed on the bed. The rain softened outside, turning into a whisper against the glass. Later, when the storm cleared, he left the room without asking for anything more. And I let him go. Back in the car, the silence was heavier than it had ever been. But this time, it wasn't avoidance. It was mourning. Because we had crossed the point of return. And both of us knew it. I stopped believing in clean lines the moment we left that motel. There was no longer a before and after, no safe categories to place things in. Right and wrong had become blurred sketches underwater. The moment we crossed that line, really crossed it, we became something that no longer fit neatly into anyone's definitions. And yet, the world around us didn't seem to notice. The city didn't collapse. The skies didn't crack open. We came home and the street looked the same. The kitchen smelled the same. The dog from next door barked at the same intervals, as though nothing had shifted. As though I hadn't unzipped my life and stepped out of it for a while. He didn't speak to me the rest of the day. Not a word. He walked upstairs with his duffel bag, the same slow, even steps I'd memorized by now. I watched from the driveway, pretending to check messages on my phone. I don't know why I waited. Maybe hoping for a glance or a pause, something to acknowledge what had just unraveled between us. But he went inside without turning his head. That night, my husband noticed I was quieter than usual. You all right? He asked, spooning rice onto his plate. You look pale. Just tired, I said. He nodded and moved on. That was his rhythm. Identify, acknowledge, accept. If I said I was tired, then that was the truth. He didn't press. He never pressed. Later, when we were brushing our teeth side by side, he told me about a promotion at work he wasn't sure he wanted. He asked if I thought we should take a trip next month. Somewhere warm, maybe. "I think we need to get out of here," he said, rinsing his mouth. "Change of pace." I nodded. I made a sound of agreement, but my mind was elsewhere, retracing the shape of his son's mouth, the curve of his back as he walked away from me. My body felt sore, not with guilt, but with the echo of memory. The next morning, he was gone before I woke. A note on the kitchen counter said he'd gone for a weekend conference in Chicago. Left early, would be back Sunday night. I held the paper in my hands longer than necessary. The handwriting looked so familiar, and yet the words felt foreign. He hadn't said goodbye. He hadn't kissed me. He trusted me. By noon, the house was nearly silent. I moved through it slowly, unsure of what I was waiting for. I made tea. I folded laundry. I listened for footsteps that didn't come. Around 3, I found myself outside his door. It was closed. I hesitated for a moment, then knocked gently. No answer. I opened it anyway. He wasn't there. His room was clean, desk organized, clothes folded in a neat pile by his bag. But there was something missing. Not physically. Nothing was gone. But the energy had shifted, as though he had already left in some way. Pulled back from the house, from me, from whatever we had let bloom too fast. I sat on the edge of his bed, unsure of how long I stayed there. The light shifted across the carpet. Dust moved in the air. I leaned back and let my head touch the wall, eyes closed. He didn't return that evening, nor the next. He stayed in his room when he was home, emerging only when necessary. And when he passed me in the hallway, his eyes slid right past me, as though I were furniture. I should have felt angry, or ashamed, or at least confused. Instead, I felt abandoned. Not in the romantic sense, not in the possessive way, but in the raw, disorienting way of someone who had been opened up and then quietly closed again, like a book returned to the shelf mid-sentence. One night, 3 days after the motel, I waited in the kitchen after dark. I didn't know why. I wasn't cooking. I wasn't hungry. I just stood there, barefoot, the cool tiles pressing into my arches, and stared out the window over the sink. He came in, finally, to get water. He didn't expect me to be there. We both froze. He opened the cabinet, grabbed a glass, filled it under the tap. His hand trembled slightly. Just a twitch. I stepped closer. Not much. Just one small step. "You're avoiding me," I said. He didn't deny it. "I don't want this to become something ugly," I added. "It already is," he said, finally meeting my gaze. "Don't you see that?" His voice was low, brittle. I saw the exhaustion in his face, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying too much. "I didn't ask for this," I whispered. "I didn't go looking for it." "I know, but it's still here. And it's too big for us to pretend it isn't." He set the glass down harder than necessary. "I'm trying to do the right thing," he continued. "I'm trying to stay away, to give us both time to breathe." "And is that working?" He laughed, bitter and hollow. "No." We stood in silence again. The fridge hummed behind us. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. "I'm not strong enough to pretend this didn't happen," I said, "and I'm not strong enough to live with it." He left the kitchen before I could respond, the glass of water untouched. That night, I changed into a nightgown he would never see, brushed my hair slower than usual, climbed into a bed that didn't feel like mine anymore. I watched the shadows on the ceiling and realized something I hadn't let myself say before. This wasn't about desire anymore. It was about absence. About how a single person can walk into your life and show you, without trying, just how much of yourself you've buried to survive. And then leave you wondering whether digging any of it back up is even worth it. The leaves were starting to fall when my husband suggested the picnic. It was his way of trying, I suppose. Reaching out across the growing distance between us with something light, something nostalgic. We used to take drives when we first married, long, aimless routes through the hills, stopping whenever we saw a view worth pausing for. Once, early in our marriage, we'd gotten lost on purpose, ending up at a roadside diner with plastic booths and the best cherry pie we'd ever had. He wanted to recreate that feeling. Something simple. A family day. I thought we could all go, he said at breakfast, pouring coffee into my cup. You, me, and him. It's been tense lately. Maybe it would help to level things. I stared at the swirl of cream in the cup before answering. All right. I wasn't sure if I said it out of guilt or curiosity. Maybe both. Something inside me wanted to see how he would behave around us now. In public, in daylight, in the shared space of a car and a picnic blanket. I wanted to test the shape of whatever boundary he had built in the silence since the motel. We packed sandwiches, fruit, a blanket. My husband insisted on bringing the old thermos that always leaked and a deck of cards we'd never actually used. It was quaint, almost sweet. I watched him hum as he packed the cooler and wondered if he had always been this easy to please or if I had simply stopped noticing. The park was an hour outside the city. Quiet, woodsy, with open fields and walking trails threading through thick groves of trees. It wasn't crowded. A few other families dotted the grass with blankets and children's laughter. But we found a secluded spot near a line of trees. Shade draped over us like a curtain. He helped spread the blanket. I unpacked the food. The son, silent but present, walked a short distance away, pretending to inspect a cluster of rocks near the edge of the path. My husband opened the thermos. Still leaks, he said, laughing. You'd think I'd remember. I smiled, but it was thin. Lunch passed in broken conversation. He asked about the cabin, about the water heater, about whether we thought the trees might need trimming before winter. I answered in brief sentences, all the while watching the man across the clearing as he sketched in a small notebook, feet tucked under him like a boy. When my husband stood and said he was going to use the restroom, a building down the hill, out of sight, the air changed immediately. Not a word had passed between us, but we both felt it. He closed his notebook, didn't look up. I stood and brushed crumbs from my skirt, walked toward the edge of the trees. He followed. We stood near a low wooden fence, backs to the clearing. From here, we could still hear the breeze moving through dry leaves, the distant chatter of strangers. It was a safe place to say unsafe things. I'm sorry, he said, his voice rougher than usual. For what? For making it harder by disappearing. You didn't make it harder, I said. You made it real. He turned to face me. His expression wasn't guarded like it had been. There was no performance here. No distance. Only exhaustion and something else. A kind of ache. I haven't been able to think clearly since that night, he said. I wanted to, but I couldn't. I didn't want you to. I know. He stepped closer. I didn't move. Sometimes, he said, I wonder if you were always this alive, and I just never saw it. No, I said without hesitation. I buried it. Long ago. You just dug it back up. We stood in silence, the world narrowing to the space between us. I felt the wind push hair across my cheek, and he reached up to tuck it behind my ear. His fingers brushed my skin, and for one heartbeat, we were suspended. If you could start over, he said. Really start. Would you? It hit me like a stone. The question I hadn't allowed myself to ask. The one I couldn't answer. Not without unraveling the fabric of everything I'd built. Not without tearing through marriage and names and shared mortgage payments and holiday cards and 15 years of dinners eaten side by side in familiar silence. I didn't look at him when I answered. I don't know. He nodded slowly like he had expected that. Maybe even preferred it to a lie. I think about it, he said. Starting over, leaving, being with someone who sees me. I see you, I said, my voice catching. I know. That's the problem. We stood like that until we heard footsteps returning. My husband's voice floated up from the path, calling my name in that easy tone he always used when we were out in public, where everything was simpler. I stepped back, adjusted my blouse, smoothed my skirt. He stayed behind for a moment longer, then returned to the blanket separately. My husband asked if we'd seen any deer. I said no. On the way home, I sat in the back seat. Let them talk about road conditions and tire pressure and how the leaves would be at peak color next weekend. I stared out the window, watching trees blur into one another like the thoughts in my head. When we got home, I went straight to the bathroom, locked the door, and stood in front of the mirror. I looked like myself. Same lipstick, same earrings, but I felt like a stranger. Because the answer I'd given him in the woods wasn't the truth. The truth had come to me in that moment when he tucked my hair away. Yes, if I could start over, I would. And now I didn't know how to live with that. Time, I had discovered, doesn't always pass in equal measure. Some days drag behind you like wet cloth, and others slip between your fingers before you can hold them. Since the picnic, I no longer trusted the rhythm of anything. My sense of time fractured, like everything else, into before and after. After the question. After my lie. If you could start over, would you? I don't know. But I did. Of course I did. And that knowing gnawed at me like moths at fabric, quietly but relentlessly, unraveling everything I had stitched together over years of habit and patience. He stopped speaking to me again. Not in cruelty, not in anger, just absence. He returned to avoiding shared spaces, slipping out of rooms as I entered, lowering his eyes at the sound of my footsteps, leaving his coffee cup in the sink without a word. It was worse than silence. It was withdrawal. And this time, it felt final. I tried to tell myself that it was for the best, that lines had been crossed, that things needed to end somewhere, and maybe this was that somewhere. Maybe he had realized what I couldn't, that nothing good would come of it, that all we had done was carve a hollow space into the middle of something that had once been whole, but knowing that didn't make the ache go away. And then, one evening, my husband did something unexpected. He poured wine, set the table, turned on the record player we hadn't used in months, the one we bought in our second year of marriage, back when we still believed that shared tastes in music could make a life feel aligned. He cooked dinner, nothing elaborate, but it smelled warm and nostalgic. Rosemary chicken, mashed potatoes, roasted carrots. A meal we used to make together on Sunday nights, back before work and fatigue took over. I stared at the table as he lit a small candle and dimmed the kitchen lights. The gesture was so painfully sincere it made my chest tighten. "What's all this?" I asked. "I've been thinking," he said, pulling out a chair for me. "I don't know when it happened, but we started living side by side instead of with each other. And I miss you." The words hit me harder than they should have. I sat down. "I know things feel strange lately," he continued. "I can't always read you the way I used to. Maybe I haven't been trying hard enough. But I want to." I looked at my plate, then at him. He was trying. Not performing, not making a statement, just trying to find something again that had slipped through both our fingers. And for a moment, I wondered if it wasn't too late. We talked through dinner, about nothing profound, the neighbor's cat, an article he read about artificial intelligence, a funny thing someone said at work. But there was warmth in it. The kind of warmth you forget you're missing until someone hands it back to you. After we cleared the plates, he didn't go to his office like he usually did. He poured a second glass of wine and sat with me on the couch, flipping through a photo album we hadn't touched in years. Our wedding, vacations, a blurry picture of me in a hotel bathrobe, laughing, holding a room service menu. He looked at it and smiled. "You are always beautiful," he said. I didn't answer. I was too busy remembering how I'd felt that day. Loose, unburdened, slightly drunk, sure of who I was. Later, when we climbed into bed, he touched my shoulder. It wasn't urgent or demanding. Just a question, asked through fingertips. I turned toward him, and for the first time in months, we made love. It was soft, familiar, gentle in the way that only long-term lovers can be. Each movement predictable, each sound known. He touched me like someone who remembered the rules, not someone trying to rewrite them. And for a brief moment, I let myself be present. I let myself respond. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of gratitude for being reminded that my body could still feel something with him. But it wasn't the same. I didn't tremble. My breath didn't catch. My mind didn't empty. I felt everything, but none of it deeply. Afterward, we lay in the quiet. He fell asleep quickly, his hand resting loosely on my hip. I stared at the ceiling, not with regret, but with clarity. It wasn't that I didn't love him. I did, in a way that was calm and rooted, like old trees or faded paperbacks. But love, I had come to realize, wasn't always enough. Not when it no longer reached the parts of you that kept growing in secret. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter in handwriting that wasn't my husband's. It was from him. Just a few words. I need to talk to you. Please. Tonight. No name, no room number, no time. But I knew where to find him. When the house fell quiet that evening, I left without telling my husband. I drove without music, the silence inside the car louder than anything I could bear. I found him on the back porch, sitting with a blanket over his lap, a notebook open but untouched. He looked up when I stepped outside. I was going to leave, he said. I know, but I couldn't. We stood in the dark for a long time, neither of us moving. I thought maybe if I stayed away, it would pass, he continued, that if we just stopped feeding it, it would die. And it didn't. I sat beside him, the cold seeping into my knees. I don't know what to do anymore, I admitted. He turned toward me, eyes heavy. Then let's just sit here until we figure it out. I nodded, and we did. We sat, side by side, not touching, not pretending, just breathing in the weight of everything we had done, everything we hadn't, and everything that still waited in the quiet between us. Sometimes I think the hardest part isn't the guilt, not even the fear. It's the choice. The moment when everything you've held in suspension demands an answer. When the pause between one breath and the next becomes unbearable, and standing still is no longer a refuge but a decision in itself. That moment had been circling me for days. After the night on the porch, everything became sharper. Every sound, every movement in the house, every glance between us. I woke each morning expecting some shift, a confrontation, a question, a goodbye. But nothing came. Life continued with its strange, stubborn insistence on rhythm. My husband returned to his usual schedule, slipping into meetings and small talk, grocery lists and car repairs. He seemed lighter after the night we'd spent together, as if something in him believed we had turned a corner. As if intimacy, no matter how fragile, could act as a seal over the cracks he had only recently begun to acknowledge. He began making plans again. A weekend trip to Vermont. A wine tasting event at the country club. We need a change of scenery, he said, handing me a brochure with fall foliage and smiling couples. Let's start fresh. The words hung between us like mist. Kind. Hopeful. Completely unaware of the storm already behind the door. I wanted to tell him. Every day I rehearsed versions of the truth. How I would say it. When. What words I would use. But each version collapsed under the weight of his face in my mind. The shock, the confusion, the betrayal. And always beneath it, the realization that what I had done hadn't come from a place of lacking love, but from finding something I hadn't known I was starving for until it touched me. With him, the sun, it wasn't just desire. It was the feeling of being known, of being seen not through the lens of who I had been for years, but for who I still was, buried beneath layers of comfort, routine, and the quiet erosion of intimacy. We hadn't spoken since that night on the porch. Not in any way that mattered. The silence between us wasn't cold. It was charged, as though the very air knew we were balancing on the edge of something irreversible. Then, one afternoon, I left the house. No note, no excuse. I drove with no destination at first, just the need to move, to escape the closed spaces of the home that no longer felt like mine. The leaves were turning, bright bursts of red and gold streaking the trees like fire. I ended up in a neighboring town, one I hadn't been to in years, and parked in front of a small cafe tucked into a side street. I didn't go inside. I sat on the bench across from the windows, wrapped my coat around me, and waited. I didn't know for sure if he would come, but something in me believed he would. An hour passed, then another. The sky began to shift, soft pinks melting into the deep blue of evening. The streetlights flickered on. People passed by without noticing me. And then he appeared. He didn't look surprised. He walked toward me with slow, certain steps, as if he too had known all along this was where the story would lead. He sat beside me without a word. We watched the street together, the passing cars, the blinking signs, the steam rising from a nearby vent. Finally, he spoke. "You left?" I needed to breathe. "Did it help?" "No." A pause. "Are you going back?" he asked, voice low. I didn't answer right away. I turned toward him, studied the lines of his face, the tension in his jaw, the softness around his eyes, the way he was both familiar and foreign, a part of my life that had begun in one form and ended in another. "I don't know how to go back," I said. He didn't reach for me, didn't try to fill the silence. He just nodded. "I don't want to hide anymore," he said finally. I looked down at my hands. "Then we'll have to face it." "What does that mean?" "It means nothing stays secret forever." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I never wanted to be the reason something broke." "You weren't," I said. "You were just the mirror." The next morning, I woke early. My husband was in the shower, humming softly. I made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, watched the sunlight stretch across the lawn like fingers reaching into a new day. I placed a folded note beside his mug. No melodrama, no pages of justification. Just the truth, quiet and direct. By the time he came downstairs, I was gone. I drove without a plan again, not to escape, but to start. There was no certainty waiting for me. No perfect ending, only the long road ahead and the knowledge that, for the first time in years, I wasn't disappearing inside someone else's idea of me. Later that afternoon, I checked into a small room on the edge of town, a temporary space, just mine, for now. I sat on the bed and watched the sky grow dark, phone silent beside me. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I wouldn't lie to myself anymore. And that, finally, felt like freedom.